Recording.
Good morning, everyone. Hope you all are doing well. And we're going to continue on, finishing up Unit 2 today, Chapter 13, looking at mineral nutrition. And that goes really hand in hand with water, so I thought it was prudent to put them both in the same week. And I think both of those quizzes should be available now, so feel free to hop on and take those whenever. I think I set the due dates a little bit closer this time just because we're starting to draw closer to the end of the semester, so just trying to tighten things up a little bit. So just be aware of that. All right. So when we're talking about minerals, we're typically talking about nutrients. I guess there is a slight difference between the two, being that a mineral you would kind of consider it being in the soil, whereas a nutrient is in the plant. So it's a mineral when it's in the soil, it's a nutrient in the plant when it's actually functioning. And they are taken into the plant primarily by the roots, but through water, not just directly sucking the nutrient out of the ground. So how does that exactly work? Well, they don't actually go directly from water into the cytoplasm in the cell. And we started to talk about that with water on Monday. There are some barriers to that uptake, and that generally is through some sort of membrane. And there are systems for each nutrient that plants need. So every nutrient has a pathway. They have special and special ways to get through the membranes and into the plant. And that starts from the root. There's membranes in the root so that they are allowing only particular things in. Don't want to just let anything in there, right? Then you could get bacteria and fungi, diseases, all that good stuff. So they have these membranes to serve so that they can just carry a single nutrient at a time and move it into the plant and then throughout it. So then once it's in the root, there are many more membranes before it actually gets into each cell. So it's kind of a complicated pathway, and recognizing that that pathway is there can help us to sort of understand nutrient uptake and issues that are associated with that in plants. So in the soil, we think of the mineral elements kind of existing in, maybe in their raw form, but nothing really exists just as the straight element. You don't have just nitrogen floating around in there. It's generally found as a charged form of the element, which we refer to as an ion. And ions have different charges and different chemical forms. Sometimes it is just that, one element positively or negatively charged, and sometimes it is a molecule. So in this table, we can see some of the typical forms that these nutrients are found in plants. And notice that in this, you can see that we have a little plus or minus symbol here next to the element itself, and that is its charge. So if it's positively charged, we consider that a cation. Negatively charged, it is an anion. And that plays a very important role in terms of how it sticks to particles in the soil and how it's able to be taken up by plants. And these different ions are really kind of looking at how they are donating or accepting electrons as well. So you can see here that some of these are existing as molecules, not just as the nutrient itself or element itself. So phosphorus, for instance, we have different phosphate molecules. It's combined with oxygen or with sulfur. We have sulfuric acid, SH here, and so on and so forth. Nitrogen, we have ammonium, ammonia, and nitrate. So different molecules for different elements that plants need to be able to complete their life cycles. As these minerals become nutrients inside the plant, we know that that is accomplished through the two different tissues that are mostly responsible for moving these nutrients up the gradient of the plant, and that is the xylem and the phloem. So xylem mostly moving upward from the roots to the shoots, phloem moving kind of all directions, but mostly from the leaves, from the kind of solar panels of the plant, the energy producers, to other parts of the plant, including the roots. So xylem carries water, phloem carries food. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's kind of how I remember and distinguish the two. Here's just a look at that in a cross section of a root. And zoom in on this a little bit. You can see here at the base of the root, we've got the meristematic zone. And if you remember, the meristem is the area where the cells are actively dividing. So this is where we're really getting root growth. And they're distinguishing between what's going to be kind of a fibrous root and what's going to be more of a feeder root. And we get into behind that meristematic zone into this kind of elongation and maturation zone. That's when we get into having the xylem and phloem. So xylem, we have two layers of xylem here that are kind of tan in color, and this outer layer is this membrane that has this Casparian strip, and that's just one of the places where nutrients are being taken into the root. Phloem here is darker brown, and combined we call the phloem and the xylem, and kind of the membranes in between them, the steel of the root. So we have to move through all these different layers to get to where nutrients are transported. Again, the phloem is delivering nutrients to this growing root, and that's why it's extending a little bit further than the xylem in this case. The Casparian strips are the waxy deposits that prevent the movement of water and ions into the xylem, or on the other end, allow the movement of water and ions into the xylem. So the plant cell walls themselves are composed of some of these chemicals we've talked about that are extremely important for the plant to make, cellulose being one of the main ones. And remember that it's just different from a starch just in just the arrangement of the molecules. Otherwise, it's pretty much just a carbohydrate, a different form of glucose, if you will. We also have hemicellulose and pectin in there. Probably familiar with pectin if you've ever made jelly or jam. That's also a very starchy substance that helps to kind of give that rigidity to the cell. Between all of this, we have our little spaces for the membrane. So pathways for the movement of nutrients. And we have two different types of movement of these nutrients in the plant. We've got symplastic, which is kind of within a membrane, and apoplastic, which is kind of between membranes. And different nutrients have different move differently, but generally they're either moving symplastically or apoplastically. The spaces in between these cell walls allow this relatively unimpeded flow of the ions and water to move. In this case, looking at kind of a upper, from above, a bird's eye view of a cross section of a root. These would be root hairs on the outside. and how they're moving in through the cortex into this Casparian strip, and then eventually into the xylem and or phloem. Phloem bringing it down from the leaves, xylem taking it up to the leaves. The endodermis, kind of like skin in a way on the inside, is composed of cells and walls that are impregnated with this waxy substance known as suberin. And this is something that plants use and utilize whenever they're wounded. So this is actually an impenetrable barrier. So if you cut a branch off of a tree or something, it's going to almost immediately begin to utilize that suberin to seal it. So this is a barrier for both water and ions, and in order to pass through that, it's got to go through a plasma membrane so that it can move into the plant itself. So if an ion is passing through this membrane, then it's got to pass through the xylem, cell to cell, through the cytoplasm, and that's the semiotic movement. And so again, just know that particular nutrients have particular ways that they're moving through, and pathways for uptake and movement. And if those pathways are interrupted somehow by some sort of dysfunction in the plant, then that's where we get issues. Nutrient deficiencies and imbalances cause a whole lot of problems in the plant that often appear to be things like they look like pest or disease problems. So it's really important to understand these pathways for the nutrients and how it works, and maybe where they get stuck along the way to the leaves or to the roots. So the major control point for this movement is that plasma membrane, which is composed of a lipid bilayer. Remember, lipids are just fats, and this makes it essentially impermeable to the ions themselves. So we asked the question, how do they get through that plasma membrane? And I think we actually already answered it earlier, and it's through a protein embedded in that membrane that serves as a channel or a carrier for the ion. Again, particular proteins for particular nutrients. And they can be extrinsic, kind of on the outside, as well as intrinsic, as well as on the inside of the membrane itself. So that's why, one of the reasons why plants need fats as well. They're making them, they need them. Some elements interact synergistically with some elements and antagonistically with other elements. So this is where we get imbalances and not just deficiencies, but I guess more, too much toxicity of an element as well. So just for example, potassium can be enhanced by adding calcium to the soil. So if we have, you would say that potassium and calcium work synergistically together. You can get more potassium, which is a major macronutrient, by having more calcium. Phosphorus, on the other hand, P, can interfere with the uptake of iron by a plant. So if you have too much phosphorus, then you don't get enough iron. So those are antagonistic to each other. Plants need all of these elements in order to complete their life cycle. And if that element in question is needed to complete its life cycle, then we consider that an essential element. And there's some debate in the world of plant nutrition about these elements, but generally it's accepted that there's between 16 and 18 of these chemical elements that are essential for the growth of most plants. And here they are. There's a little mnemonic device here to help you remember those. C. Hopkins Cafe, managed by my cousins, Mo, Nigel, and Clyde, referring to carbon for C. Hopkins is hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, potassium, nitrogen, and sulfur. Cafe is calcium and iron, Ca and Fe. Magnesium, boron, managed by manganese, my cousins, copper, and zinc. And then Mo, Nigel, and Clyde, molybdenum, nickel, and chlorine, respectively. So whether you find that it's prudent to memorize that or not, that's up to you, but just know that these are the elements that are essential to plants. And each of these kind of have different levels at which they are required by the plant. It doesn't necessarily mean that the plant needs them all the time. In fact, these different elements play different roles in the life cycle of the plant, but at some point they need it all in order to finish its life cycle, to actually go to flower, fruit, and seed. So let's break these elements down. First into the big three, and you might recognize these as being crucial for all the metabolites in a plant: C, H, and O, the three what we would call organic minerals, because they are the minerals that are needed for life in general. All living things have to have these three, and most of matter is composed of these three. In plants, over 95%, in some plants up to 99% of the dry weight is composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And these are not coming that much from the soil. We do get a little bit of this from organic matter in the soil, plants and animal parts that have broken down in the soil, but most of it is coming through air and water. We're getting carbon and oxygen from carbon dioxide. We're getting hydrogen and oxygen from water. All of the other nutrients, what we would kind of consider the mineral nutrients, because they are coming from that parent rock, that broken down material, they come from the soil itself. And in situations, of course, in controlled environment agriculture, where we're having things like hydroponics or aeroponics even, we still have to figure out ways to supply these nutrients, since they're not coming from, kind of what we traditionally would consider soil. Instead, it's some sort of media. So among the rest of the nutrients, we divide them into groups according to the way and the quantity that plants use of them. So first we have the primary macronutrients. And if you've used a fertilizer before, then you're familiar with these, because these are the three that are listed in big numbers on the bag: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, or N, P, and K. And I think it is important to memorize at least what the elements stand for, so you know which nutrient you need to supply. So these primary macronutrients are those that behind carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. If you were to take those out of the picture, then these three would be 95% of what was left. Nitrogen is by far the most needed, and that's because it is actually in the chlorophyll molecule itself. And that, I'm not saying that these are less important, they're also equally important, but nitrogen is usually the one that is found in the least supply. Then we have the secondary macronutrients, and these are needed in fairly large amounts, relatively large amounts, but much less than our primary macronutrients. And those are calcium, Ca, magnesium, Mg, and sulfur, S. Then we have everything else are our micronutrients, which we also refer to as trace elements. All right, so let's talk a little bit about their roles in plants. So first, nitrogen is, as I mentioned, part of chlorophyll. It's also in the nucleic acids, also a huge role in proteins and the synthesis of amino acids into proteins. So it's important for pretty much every part of the plant's life cycle. It has to have nitrogen in order to be able to utilize the carbohydrates to make everything else the plant needs. And generally we think of nitrogen as being the most limiting nutrient because it's so mobile. It moves through the soil and through, it's very water soluble. So it moves through the soil solution very quickly. And if you were to think about the relationships between, say, nitrogen and water, and how those two kind of play a role together, both in good ways and in bad ways. So for the plant, it's good, right? We have to have that nitrogen move the water so it can get into the plant. But if it doesn't get into a plant, then it is often polluting water. So nitrogen is the second highest pollutant of water, just behind sediment, particles of soil. So phosphorus P is also used in proteins and photosynthesis. But I think one of the most important roles that distinguishes phosphorus' role is in respiration. It's also a component of the phospholipids, which are in those membranes. So it's responsible for a lot of transfer processes of these other nutrients. Potassium, also important in the synthesis of proteins, and also a catalyst for enzyme reactions. Another thing that distinguishes potassium, I think, is its ability to kind of help open and close the stomata, the pores on the undersides of the leaves. So it's also partially kind of there in its water relations with plants. So it helps for transpiration. So again, these are primary macronutrients, N, P, and K. And you can see with these functions why they're so important, they're needed in such large amounts. The secondary nutrients, macronutrients, are calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. Calcium is very similar in plants as it is in people. Think of it as, being kind of a structural support. So we need calcium for our bones. Plants need it for kind of their version of bones, the cell walls, as well as just for cell growth and division. The skins of fruits usually have a lot of calcium in them. Magnesium is also essential in the formation of chlorophyll. There's a lot more nitrogen in a chlorophyll molecule than magnesium. I think there's like one magnesium or atom in a chlorophyll molecule, but nonetheless, it is essential in there, and that's why it is considered a secondary macronutrient. Sulfur is essential also for amino acids and vitamins. And for some plants like brassicas and alliums, your cabbages and onions, it does impart that sulfury flavor, which in large doses is not a pleasant thing, but in small doses can add a lot of flavor to your foods. But sulfur is also very important in playing a role in maintaining the pH of the soil too. All right, so then our micronutrients, there's all kinds of those micronutrients out there. This is not an exhaustive list, and some plants need more than what are kind of listed in our typical lineup of micronutrients. They each have kind of smaller but equally important roles. Some plants need them a little bit more than others. So I think it's very important to know your crop and know what its nutrients are. If all other elements are present in the sufficient qualities, but just one of them is deficient, then the plant will not complete its life cycle properly. And from this, they developed this concept of the law of the minimum. And basically, we're just saying that that element, until it is supplied in that sufficient amount, will not allow the other elements and nutrients to function properly, to basically allow the plant to do its thing. another issue with that is that you might have those elements there, but maybe they're either in too many or too high of quantities. In some cases, we get imbalances, which can affect the mobility in the plant. It can prevent a nutrient from being moved to the part that a plant needs. So mobility is also really important in being able to tell where and when a plant is deficient of a nutrient, how you can kind of diagnose a nutrient deficiency based on whether that element is mobile or immobile. So immobile elements cannot be scavenged by plants. And what we're saying there is the ones that are movable, plants will take out of, say, the lower leaves and move them to the new growth. So once a leaf has kind of done its thing, produce all the photosynthates that it can, if those nutrients are mobile, then they will move from those leaves into new leaves. And we'll start to see the older leaves die back. And that's, kind of a natural thing in really all plants. We go from the source leaves to the sink leaves, and then once those leaves have kind of finished, then they die. The immobile elements, on the other hand, cannot move. So this helps to diagnose nutrient deficiencies, because if it is a deficiency of an immobile element, then we'll see kind of the symptoms of it in the new leaves. If it's a deficiency of a mobile element, then we'll see the deficiency symptoms in the old leaves. So let's talk about each of these nutrients in a little bit more detail. And starting with the one that I think is the most important, because it is usually the most lacking. In fact, if you do a soil test and you ship it off to the testing laboratory at Virginia Tech, they don't even look at nitrogen. They don't analyze it, because by the time you get the results of the test, it's likely that nitrogen has already moved. It is found in all plants, and it is the most commonly deficient in our plant growing systems. And there are two main forms. I think the book says that these are the only two forms of nitrogen that the plant can absorb and utilize. There are a couple of other forms, but these are the two main forms: ammonium, NH4+, positively charged, and nitrate, NO3-. And there are many other forms that nitrogen exists, but they are unavailable to plants. They are made available to plants through a series of these chemical reactions that we refer to the nitrogen cycle, which, like the other cycles we talked about, the water cycle, the carbon cycle, it is critical to life on Earth. So let's take a look at it. Here's just a very simplified version of the nitrogen cycle. And we talked about how in air, there's actually more nitrogen than there is oxygen, more nitrogen than there is anything else. So we have all this nitrogen up here floating around in this form, N2, two nitrogen atoms bonded together. And that N2 needs to be fixed so that it can become available to plants. And there are a couple of different ways that happens. It can be fixed by nitrogen fixing bacteria, rhizobium, in the roots of plants like legumes. And in that case, it's taking that nitrogen and bonding it to hydrogen to form ammonium. It can also be fixed by lightning. So there's actually been some experiments with putting lightning rods in cropping areas buried in the soil, so that you get some fixation through lightning. And that will take that nitrogen gas, and through this high heat reaction, put it into a form in the soil, generally in nitrate, NO3-. So nitrate is the form that is most accessible to plants. So just keep that in mind. We also have nitrite, which is kind of a lesser form of nitrate. And different types of bacteria in the soil other than rhizobium are kind of part of this process of nitrification and denitrification. So where it's converting it from ammonium to nitrite to nitrate in many cases. And that's very important because, again, nitrate is the most available to plants and is the least likely to move. So it's the most stable form as well. So we get mineralization of these nutrients of nitrogen in its different forms from dying plant and animal parts above and in the soil. And that will return to the soil, be mineralized from kind of more simple forms of nitrogen, and through decomposition and through bacteria, be converted into ammonium, and then eventually to nitrite and nitrate, which is then absorbed by plants. And then it starts the cycle over, because then, in the leaves, eventually they will fall and some nitrogen will be returned to the earth. So again, nitrogen fixation is carried out in some plants, mostly the legumes, but some other types of plants as well. And that's just converting that atmospheric gas into ammonia by different types of bacteria. And rhizobia that's the main class that have the greatest importance to agriculture. And we find those in the legumes, peas and beans, soy, alfalfa, and that's why they are great for cover crops that we will then kind of plow under the soil or use herbicides to kill them to return that nitrogen to the soil. It's really pretty amazing process because we have figured out how to fix nitrogen ourselves through using a lot of energy and a lot of natural gas, high pressure, high temperature reactions. Rhizobia are able to do it at room temperature with very little energy. So we talked early on about the symbiotic relationship with plants and these bacteria. It's a mutualistic relationship, as the plants are giving home, a little shelter to these bacteria and supplying them with the carbohydrates, while the bacteria are supplying the plants with ammonium, needed form of nitrogen. So we have these nodules on the roots of this plant of a legume here, and that's where these bacteria live. When we take a cross section of a nodule, we'll see tissues that are different than in other parts of the root. And you can see in these kind of dark areas, those are the areas that are actually infected with the bacteria itself. We think of infection as a bad thing, but in this case, it's a very good thing. And there are millions of bacteria that live in these cells. So I mentioned that we figured out a way to do this, kind of the same idea, converting atmospheric nitrogen to ammonium at high temperature and great pressure with some sort of catalyst present. So we use natural gas, and basically you're just taking nitrogen out of the air and heating that nitrogen gas up to very high temperatures under high pressure, and usually binding it to a salt. And then we use that as a fertilizer. So this is an energy intensive and expensive process, but it is responsible for an extreme amount of the nitrogen that goes into the food supply. And they suggest that it's a high percentage of the nitrogen in the cells in our bodies are actually made through this Haber-Bosch process. The industrial kind of synthesized fertilizer. In the kind of natural box, the plants are supplying the carbohydrates that the plants need. And methane, natural gas, CH4 is, it's not a carbohydrate itself, but you're getting the carbon and hydrogen that, comes from that carbohydrate in it. But in this case, the plant is supplying all the carbohydrates that it needs, all the energy to the bacteria. And this is occurring at regular pressure and at kind of regular temperature. And they're able to convert the sugar and the atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia. So unfortunately, chemists have not been able to recreate this under low temperature and pressure. In both of these processes, carbon dioxide is a byproduct. But in the case of nitrogen fixing bacteria in the soil, carbon dioxide is released into the soil rather than into the atmosphere. So nitrogen availability is the transformation of nitrogen in its kind of gaseous form or in the mineral forms in the soil. And so it starts with mineralization, which is converting that organic nitrogen into a form in the soil. And again, that's usually happening through bacteria. So we have ammonification, which is the conversion of nitrogen to ammonium, and then ammonium to nitrate, first to nitrite and then to nitrate through nitrification. And those are very important parts of the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen can be supplied to plants as ammonia or as urea or ammonium, and also as nitrate. Ammonia and urea, though, have to be converted to ammonium in the soil before plants can easily take it up. So nitrate itself is an anion, negatively charged ion, and because of that, it is easily leached from the soil through water, because water generally has a positive charge to it. So through precipitation over irrigation, it's easily leached, which contributes to nitrogen deficiency. And here's just a look at what nitrogen deficiency looks like in this case in a tomato. If you ever see yellowing of plant tissues and it's happening on the lower leaves, then usually that's a nitrogen deficiency. And it's fairly easy to supply that, again, because nitrogen is so mobile, it quickly moves into the plant. So if you just fertilize with any type of nitrogen fertilizer, whether that be kind of natural forms like manure or a synthetic form, either way, plants can easily take it up. They can take it up through the roots. You can also supply nitrogen through a foliar feed as well. Not all nutrients are just coming through the roots. We can get some of them in through the leaves. That is not a long-term solution, though. It's usually very temporary. But if you need nutrients fast, you can sometimes get them directly into the leaves. So foliar spray of nitrogen works as well. If the problem is not corrected, then the plant cannot photosynthesize. It'll starve those lower leaves, and it'll continue up the plant till eventually it starves itself and dies, because it's trying to produce chlorophyll and can't do it. Phosphorus P, on the other hand, plays many vital roles in the plant cell, as we mentioned. We consider it the second most limiting element for plant growth. And that's usually because most of the phosphorus that is naturally in soil is tied up in organic matter. pH plays a role in all nutrients, and I think we looked at that when we're first talking about soils. For pH, generally we want somewhere around neutral for the greatest variety of elements. Generally, we say slightly acidic, though, 5.5 to 6.5 for most of our crops. So if we have a pH below 6 or above 8, then that inhibits the uptake of phosphorus. Phosphorus also has kind of a mutualistic relationship with a organism in the soil, and in this case it's mycorrhiza, and it's not a bacteria. In this case it's a fungi, and it helps to plants to uptake phosphorus. Usually grows as kind of this fungal sheath that goes around the plant surface, but then also kind of infiltrates and extends into and in between the epidermis and into the cortex of the root, and helps to supply phosphorus. So here's just kind of a look at that closer. The fungus can absorb it from the soil and carry it back to the plant. And again, it's kind of the same as with the nitrogen fixing bacteria. The plant is supplying carbohydrates to it, and then the mycorrhiza is getting it the phosphorus that it needs. So today, mycorrhiza and rhizobium as well, both of these living symbiotes are available for purchase. You can actually get them. It's kind of funny to think that somewhere out there there's a kind of a factory, an industrialized form of production of fungi and bacteria, but for agricultural purposes. But it's happening. Someone somewhere is able to produce mycorrhiza. Maybe it's in a lab or something, but be interesting to look at what that process exactly entails. Either way, they're breeding these symbionts and putting them into a form that you can apply. So if you want to ensure nitrogen fixation, then you'll buy like a powdered rhizobium bacteria that you'll inoculate your seeds with before planting them. Same with mycorrhiza, except they do that in the soil mixes themselves. So you can buy commercial mixes that already have mycorrhiza in them, or you can buy like a mycorrhiza powder to apply to the soil itself. Phosphorus deficiencies, also it is mobile, so it's not quite as mobile as nitrogen, but we're going to see those first in the lower leaves because they are mobile. And generally you'll see kind of a darker green color, yet kind of mixed red or purplish color, and often on the undersides of the leaves. And if we don't correct that, then we get kind of spindly, leggy plants. And in this image, these plants are being grown in perlite, which perlite is a media form that we add to different mixes, usually to provide drainage. It can't really hold on to a lot of these positively charged ions, so it easily leaches off. So in this case, you can see that it's probably deficient of both nitrogen and phosphorus, giving a kind of a bronzy color. So that's another thing that's important to note, is that they interact with each other, and deficiency symptoms can work together to kind of make it confusing to diagnose the deficiencies. So sometimes we can supply phosphorus, or sometimes we can even supply a mycorrhiza to help phosphorus become more available. Potassium, the K in NPK is critical again for the opening and closing of the stomata, which is very important for the plant's respiration and transpiration, as well as photosynthesis. And it's also required for the activation of all kinds of different enzymes. It's a positively charged ion that is retained in the soil. Because it is of its positive charge, it's not as easily leached. So potassium we can definitely have potassium deficiency, but it's less likely than nitrogen or phosphorus deficiency, because it's more easily stored, and there are lots of sources of it naturally and synthetically. So potassium deficiency can look like, and we'll see a lot of deficiencies look similar to this. Again, it is still mobile, and again, less mobile than nitrogen, but because it is mobile, we'll see the deficiency symptoms on the older leaves. So we'll start to see it as chlorosis, which chlorosis is just yellowing, can't make the chlorophyll, so it's chlorosis, and that starts at the margins of the leaf. So in this case, for potassium, we'll see it starting on the outside and kind of moving in between the veins, interveinal chlorosis. In monocots, though, our grasses, grains, symptoms usually start as a tip chlorosis, and it spreads along the margins instead of along the veins. Again, if we don't correct it, then the plant can't function properly, and that will eventually spread to the entire leaves, and eventually it will cause the plant to not be able to transpire and respire and die. Calcium, a kind of secondary macronutrient, has several roles, giving stable structure to the plant, and deficiency is a problem, not only just not having calcium, but also a problem if the plant cannot transport calcium to the rapidly growing tissues quick enough. And usually what we see for calcium deficiencies is tissues of fruit often collapsing and looking like they're becoming soft or rotted. See that as like tip burn in lettuce, or in tomato, in the fruits themselves, we see blossom end rot, which is often confused for blight. Calcium deficiency can also lead to all kinds of other symptoms in other plants. Development of flowers, apples can be caused by calcium deficiency as well. So it's in the skin of the plant, and if it can't make that skin, then it kind of caves in and looks like it's almost like a fungal disease. We can use foliar applications of calcium to prevent further injury from that. It's not going to cure what's already happened, but it will prevent further injury. So if you've grown tomatoes before, you might have seen this product out there called Blossom End Rot Stopper. And it's basically just a spray that has calcium nitrate in it, and you spray it right on the leaves, and it will help to prevent problems. In this case, again, kind of growing it in perlite, so not easily able to hold on to it. It just causes the plant to pretty much be deformed and almost die, in this case in pansies, without calcium. Magnesium also plays several roles, but two main ones stand out, and that's that it is in chlorophyll, and it's also a necessary component of ATP, and therefore in all the reactions that involve ATP, that critical for moving energy. So deficiency of magnesium, we usually see interveinal chlorosis of the lower leaves. We're going to see this time and time again, but it distinguishes it from nitrogen deficiency in that it's in between the veins, interveinal, whereas for nitrogen, it's the whole leaf. So we can usually treat magnesium deficiencies through foliar or soil applications of magnesium sulfate, aka Epsom salts. Iron is another micronutrient that plays a major role in plants, and we often see iron deficiencies. And for iron, Fe, it's because it's very pH dependent. It is an immobile element, so instead of seeing it in the older leaves, we'll see it in the newer leaves. So we also see that interveinal chlorosis, but that is a way to distinguish it from other deficiencies like nitrogen or magnesium, because it's in the new leaves rather than the old leaves. And adjusting soil pH is often the best way to correct soil-related iron deficiencies. So if we are trying to diagnose plant problems related to nutrient deficiencies, there's a lot of things we have to look at. First, these symptoms can vary from plant to plant. If a deficiency, if one nutrient is deficient, then likely there are multiple that are deficient. So in those cases, you're going to have different symptoms. And also many of these symptoms are similar to the symptoms of pests and disease. So knowing them, I think really knowing your crop best and what these look like are the best ways to be able to easily diagnose nutrient deficiencies. If you suspect that you have a deficiency, a good strategy would be to start to supply a small amount of one of those nutrients and wait a little while, usually only a few days, to see if there's a reaction. We can also do soil and leaf analysis, taking samples of whatever it is, sending it to a tissue, sending a tissue, excuse me, to a lab for analysis, or there are tools that you can analyze that yourself. You can collect runoff from containerized plants, and you can test your soil. I mean, these are all ways to kind of look at what nutrients might be insufficient. We also have this idea of remobilization, so that plants can move these nutrients to the places that they most need them. And we most often look at this as moving them into roots or to seeds. So those are why those parts of the plant are the most nutrient dense for foods for people as well. And finally, we'll just kind of move these different nutrients throughout the season, in this case in beans. And that will take care of our discussion on mineral nutrition. Anybody have any questions or comments or concerns? All right, well, you guys have a great weekend.
Okay, you too. And try to behave.
Hasta la vista.
Yes.